Welcome to The Realign with Reed Watermouth. In this episode, I speak with Gordon White, founder of Rune Soup and author of several books on magic and the animist worldview. His most recent book was Ani.Mystic, Encounters with the Living Cosmos, published in 2022 by Scarlet Imprint. Gordon and I discuss his book and the profound work of custodianship, creating sanctuary, and leaving the Western materialist-reductionist framework. Information on Gordon's work is available at the end of this episode. By doing all of these podcasts, all of these interviews with all of these absolutely disparate people who all actually have something really profound in common, you've been kind of holding space and building a community that doesn't really, like no one else. I mean, there are definitely people who realize you're doing this, but I always think of the way that other people act like, oh, Gordon is a solo, egoist, individualist, on the other side of the world who is just doing, his own thing for his own good. And I was like, oh, wait, no, it's absolutely the opposite. You've all of the people you've interviewed, I'm like, well, no one talks to these people, or not enough people talk to them. And here you are talking to them and constantly holding a space for them. And I was like, well, so one, I wanted you to do the first one of these of Realign. And then secondly, I wanted to make sure you got a chance to talk as not somebody who's trying to cultivate the community, which you have been doing, forever, but actually someone who's also part of something bigger,
Yeah, cool. I mean, thanks for noticing, right? Because from the very beginning of the podcast, back in almost early podcasting days, I called it my song for the lonely, because obviously I've got to do a show reference, right? But it really was. I mean, you grew up remotely as well. I grew up in regional Australia. And I would read these magic books, Pete Carroll, I'm not going to mention too many more of the Brits because they have disappointed me very much over the last few years. But I couldn't does Pete Carroll live in a tower? That would be awesome. I assume he lives in a tower by the sea. They just seem so magical and larger than life to me, right? In Newcastle, Australia, there are no Pete Carrolls. And so it was a way of turning initially authors, but not just, into normal human beings, and not in a way of bringing them down, but in a way of making them available. Because the early podcasts were those sort of, in-ear situations where very often you'd put them on an actual iPod rather than just on a mobile phone. But there's something actually quite intimate and penetrative about in-ear earbuds. And the first time I was listening to podcasts, in my early 20s was, it felt like that. Like there's someone in my head and like a normal person, right? This isn't just like a radio presenter or something. So the goal from the very beginning was, I would sort of say, for some kid on her way to college in a bus in Ohio, to be able to listen to these people and for them to be real to her, was the beginning. So yes, I'm glad that you can see that the goal from the very first was space or placemaking. And I hate all these words we're going to use will be bringing trouble to. I don't like the word space. I don't like the word community. I don't I don't like any of these words, but I know what you mean, right? Like a togetherness, a relationality, that kind of thing. And that was there from the beginning, for sure.
I have a particular disgust for the word community.
Yeah,
because of
really good TV show,
where
but the word is a mess, and every time it comes out of your mouth, I'm like, this is the C word I am most ashamed to say.
Yeah, I would add though that there's a deep desire behind the word, but it's a lot like friends after Facebook, where people say friend, and there's a desire for real deep connection there. But the word friend now, for most, it's hard to attain that deep, profound meaning below it. Instead, it's tainted by all of this other stuff. And community is the same way. My gaming community online,
Yeah, interesting you think Facebook destroyed the word friend. I think Twitter did. I think when people say hi friends, just to let you know, like I've started a GoFundMe because my eye is fucked and I need, um, announce it. There's those words that Twitter people use that signal that they're Twitter people, and one of them is friends, and it makes my skin crawl because it's an assumption. Like if I'm reading that, if someone says hi friends, if you've ended up in my feed, you've made assumptions about how I see the world that I'm reasonably medium high confident we're not in alignment about if you announce a hi friends. So Facebook didn't destroy it. I haven't used Facebook in more than 10 years, but it didn't destroy the word friend for me. Twitter did. There you go.
See, I was very late to Twitter. I didn't
Okay.
get, I couldn't understand it. Like, wait, 140 characters. Like, what's worth saying? You know? And then I had the sense that, oh, okay, well, I guess this is for a certain kind of people. And then I finally got on it and I'm like, okay, this is interesting. But there is a unique and restraining voice that you use on Twitter. Everyone uses it. You learn how to use that voice very quickly by reading everyone else. And then you start mimicking this voice, and everyone then is speaking in the same voice, even if they are arguing. Even if they completely
Yeah.
hate each other, they're all like, hey, or the introduction of a long thread that's, look, I'm going to try to get you excited to read a second tweet, We adopt all of these words, all of these phrases, these phrasings, these frameworks, I think, for the language, and that, that has shaped the way that we think. But friend was a Facebook thing for me. I mean, well, actually maybe MySpace, but MySpace was, wow, it was innocuous and like, naive and innocent, like compared to everything else that came around. I owed you a review of Ani.Mystic because I told you I would review it. But every single time I'd attempt to sit down to write this review, I realized it was too complex for one. A book review ultimately kind of reduces the book. You're trying to tell somebody in 2,000, 3,000 words about a book, but in a sense, it is as if there are 6 different books in Ani.Mystic that are, it's almost a series. Like it's one complete book, but there's so much in each of these sections because you're coming at the idea of, or the framework of animism from multiple perspectives. It's the troubling, the
Yeah.
coming at things directly but not directly at all that you continuously do in it. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and I think your description of animism, because we're always trying to describe it in a way that makes sense within English. But I think, you offer several definitions, but the one that is the clearest, I think, is just the reality of spirits. When
Sure.
you're discussing the book people and the academic frameworks and the attempts that they make to understand animism, to translate animism into non-animistic frameworks, and they always miss the crucial aspect of the fact that there is no animism without spirits. The whole point is the reality of spirits, and everything else comes from that. Would you talk a bit more of that, and also the way that it's very difficult to understand animism from a Western framework?
Yeah, sure. So, um, the reality of spirits is a co-reality, right? Because with the reality of spirits comes our obligation, and even that almost sounds too contractual. But in the same way that you sort of have an obligation to breathe out carbon dioxide so that plants can metabolize it and breathe out oxygen, there's a reciprocity to a universe that is composed of a community of beings. And like the best word we have for that in the West, and there's honestly not too much wrong with it. Like spirit is from the Latin meaning breath. There's a lot of kind of medicine in that word, and so it's useful. Like we kind of play a few word games in the book, right? But spirits is fine, and it's, you are either in a cosmos that is composed, that is a community of beings that is filled with spirits, and community of beings is better, right? Because a cosmos can then be some kind of like globe that we put spirits in, but then you're sort of stuck with, well, who made the globe? And it's like, well, now you're back with some kind of like monotheistic creation framework, which you can find in so-called animist cosmologies, but isn't necessary. It's community of beings. That's what it is, right? And we're using the C word again. But so this is something that, I mean, this is a bit naive, and I know people in the 18th and 19th century sort of thought this, but I honestly believe human cognition starts with that awareness, like as a child. And I think we have it written out of us, literally written out of us, right? So it's one of the, you can nod along and say, yes, spirits are real, because spirits are real in other frameworks. Spirits are real in basically every other framework, or they have a category of realness in every single framework, including atheism, where they are a thing that is not real. They are a superstition or a fictional artifact. So every framework has spirits. Animism is like, the whole thing is made of them, right? And it's actually an important distinction when you, and you can trip up and think you're kind of like doing animism when you're actually still in the snow globe where spirits exist, but you haven't stepped into the relational implications of that. And that's the part that's very, very difficult, I think, in particularly a capitalist framework, to understand that you are relationally composed. And in fact, if you look at like the Tsutuhilmaya or whatever, if they don't do ceremonies and essentially feed the spirits, feed the gods, the universe ends, right? Like it's serious business. There's that relationality is not learning the name of his spirit so he can give you a promotion at work. It's baked into a cosmos as community of beings, and it's been very interesting over the last few years, 5 or 10 or so, I guess, to see the A word get very popular in areas that had previously used words like neo-pagan or whatever, right? And some people are making the shift, as in they're sort of exploring and inhabiting, I would say, an animist framework, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are still in a globe with spirits, and it's honestly with the best will in the world. It's people kind of feel a pull to it. The word is, I think, one of its last gifts, because I talk about this in the book. It is really dangerous. It is a really fraught word, where we get it from and what it initially meant and so on. And I think because of that, it still has this charge. And one of its last gifts is to pull people, almost trick them into it. And that was what the book was. I actually got like, when I knew it was going to be quote unquote about animism, but I sort of got not stuck in this infinite loop, but had to kind of convey in a loop. This is a book about animism and why animism is a dangerous term, and why it's actually audacious to, and not always just in a good sense, to be using that term, right? It carries everything. It is a perfect carrier for kind of like everything we've done wrong over the last 220 years, in terms of the more than human world, in terms of other human beings. So you have two options when that happens, right? You can abandon it and never use that word again. And in fact, one of the Indigenous curators at the State Library in Sydney that I was talking to doing the book, he says, we don't use that word. And I'm like, yeah, just out of interest, what word do you use? And I'm like, we don't have a word. This is just like how we roll, you know. And he was of the opinion, I didn't think I fully convinced him, but he was of the opinion, like, no, this is, like, he works in the State Library as an Indigenous curator, so he's right on the coalface of how information and reality is categorized in different frameworks. And he's like, this is a very dangerous word. And I'm like, that's why I'm writing the book. we can agree on that.
So one of the problems with animism I've noticed when attempting to talk to other people who have a general sense of it, it's still not even clear what we're talking about, because oftentimes people use the term spirit as if it is this, unifying ground of being that everything is composed of, but then everything is also, but it doesn't go any further. Like, your spirit, I'm spirit, spirits are inside of us. There's an animating force to the actual really existing thing. Is how they tend to look at it. It's very difficult to move past the the material, and you talk a lot about, and I would argue slightly with it, the materialist-naturalist framework. I would call that materialist-reductionism, but we're talking about exactly the same thing, where there's this attempt to reduce everything to the material, and then also to, if there is something else, you can allow it to exist in a imaginary internal space that, oh yeah, you could talk about us all having spirits, and that's really cute, and that helps. That's very useful for culture making and keeping society cohesive, but there's no consequence to that idea. And the animism that you're presenting, which I think is quite clear, is much closer to the animism that the actual existing animism in most cultures, except for ours, has really profound, deep consequences and makes demands at the same time that we make demands on it.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
on the matter of language, go ahead, please.
Oh no, like, and that's what I meant with like the reciprocity, is you, because you are co-created, and not just with whatever spirits are, like you are relationally composed. We have, see, I like naturalism because it's like the botanist describing with his silly little paints, like a plant that actually is a being that already has a name, right? Is where I went with it. I got it from Tim Ingold. It's not like I made it up. The trouble, this is literally the yardstick. You can work out, and I hate to kind of say it this, well, maybe I don't hate to say it this way, but coming through industrialization and what that did to the sense of the human personality, and whatever we want to call this, capitalism, post-capitalism, or whatever, it's been possible to outsource the consequences of not being relational for about 100 and so years, right? And that's coming to an end in a bunch of different ways. But you notice with that kind of everything is spirit model that you get to live in a so-called inspirited universe without the consequences, without the relationality, right? And that's kind of how you can tell if people are there yet. Animism should horrify you in the sense of, in a good way, like, oh my goodness, like once you realize what's involved. And I find it very optimistic rather than pessimistic. I think the pessimism comes from like a machine universe view, but you'll know it. You'll know that it is a framework that is built on Ani, which is the Quechua word for it, like that sort of relationality, and that you find anywhere. The Kogi would say that whatever climate change is actually caused by all these sacred objects being taken from around the world and put in European museums, right? And because we've sort of destroyed the web of relationality. Again, we feed the spirits, or the spirit world, and the spirit world feeds us. And these sacred beings, these stone beings, and stuff that adorns the museums, is enmeshed in those obligations. And if you rip them up and take them away, then you've undone these obligations, right? And even if you don't, which would be surprising for people listening to this or watching this, even if you don't think that's some kind of true, it's why I'm haunted by that idea, is it is actually true in the sense that if we lived in a world where museums realized that we should probably put a lot of this stuff back, the thinking that goes behind that is a thinking that can actually, a society that can come to that decision happily is a society that is ready to return to relationality, right? So it's kind of caught in this, it's like, it's a curse as well as an obligation, right? Like, or more of a doom to put on European museums to kind of realize, for European culture to be a thing that understands that there's a reality to these objects that they've interfered with and they should probably go back.
I love that. That's a beautiful way of putting it. We can focus on that primary thing, but it's part of a larger change in consciousness. I don't really like that phrase, but once you decide, wait, we should not have taken these things, then you also start deciding, or you probably previously decided, hey, we're messing everything up here. Let's try to return this. not just return these artifacts, but also let's kind of return ourselves a bit. Yeah, that's beautiful. On the matter of the climate change, you mentioned very often the problem and kind of the uselessness of the concepts of environment and nature. And you do a lot of it's very brilliant in the book. You do a lot of what you call jailbreaking English, or attempting to describe things or to translate in a way that what is the I can't remember who you were quoting, but betrays the language into which you're translating, so that you almost like the original ideas transform the language that it's being translated into in order to accommodate these really profound, complex ideas that our language cannot, or our language currently does not have. And part of the problem is when we speak of nature, of environment, and particularly, you make a great point, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the matter of place versus space. So could you talk about the problems of nature? It's that I think has always been personally for me difficult to move past, because I have a sense of nature that allows for these other things, but even still, I realize when I'm talking about nature, most people are still thinking of this idea of something that's outside of us.
That's the key, right? Like the word nature arises kind of like the face to vase thing with some idea of human exceptionalism, right? So there's the human realm and there's the natural realm, and again, you don't find a word for this anywhere else, right? This is something that happened. This sort of a number of king hits that happened to our thinking, beginning with the Greeks and then kind of like moving through European thought. We had a number of king hits where there are words for, and even the word landscape, I kind of take a bat to for the same reason, but there are words for places and place beings in every other language. But again, these are communities that you're in relation to, right? So, and there are country and nation. So there's sky country, there's the owl nation. So there are ways of, but there's an owl nation and you will be in a nation as well. And the shark has a nation, right? So it's still this kind of, we're all in the one thing, right? You might call it states in a country or something, when you say nature, what you've done is separated out everything that isn't human reality elsewhere. And even if you're doing it for benign reasons, it is erroneous thinking that has only one conclusion, which we're experiencing. And it's not just the destruction, right? Like it is the idea that it must be protected and managed, and it activates, which we're seeing now, that sort of technocratic centralizing control impulse. And even if that's coming from a understandable concern for what we would consider the more than human world, the error is in the thinking, and the error is hidden in these words we use, like climate, which doesn't exist. Like there's no such thing as climate. It is an artifact of European measuring models, and the very idea that a planet can have a single temperature is only exists in spreadsheet lands, right? This is one of Tim Ingold's things, and he spent decades with like the Sami in the Arctic and whatever, and they don't have climate, right? They have sky and they have place, and how you are in the more than human world with that thinking is very different. With climate, you don't have to be in it. You can be in Geneva looking at a spreadsheet and then say, right, well, we're going to seize this forest from these people because of carbon. And you're still imperializing. You're still actually, and all of that comes down from this split, this beautiful, and splitting it out as nature. What happened particularly with, say, like the Romantics, is that they did it in a loving sense. That, like, these people were quite impressed by the more than human world and kind of painted it. So it's not even like it's a cynical mustache twirling land grab. It is in some cases, I think today. I think it's very cynical when you can sort of, when Nestle can buy entire rivers and so on. But it's the most dangerous stuff, the most dangerous thoughts are the ones that kind of you think are good, right? Right. You think you're doing the right thing. And and it's a really challenging thing to unpick because it's like a post-political journey, right? Like to unpick progressivism because it's the same cognitive error is is a long and it's well, that's one big onion because there's a lot that's in there that you're like, oh, but I I want nice things for other people, and that's all kind of caught up in it. So when I say there's no such thing as climate, I'm literally a climate denier. It doesn't mean I don't think the planet's warming. Um, it's it's that the climate doesn't exist, right? And actually, if you operate in that if framework, you actually start to see, I would say, more medicinal ways of existing. And this is something I kind of learned from Charles Eisenstein because he has this excellent book called Climate: A New Story. And if you look at the last 50 years of environmentalism, it actually began pretty good. Here in Tasmania, the Greens Party, which is an absolute dumpster fire at the moment, but started down here for very good reasons. Some gay dentist was off like kayaking and decided to protest a dam, and it worked, right? This is one of the least human spoiled places on earth in southwest Tasmania. So that kind of, we went from think local, act local to think local, act global to do what globalists say, right? And that is not good. That is that further centralizing of what is a true impulse, a true and powerful impulse. And this is kind of what I want to do with the words is to make people go, and really sit with it. And Charles is really good at this because he said we've basically spent particularly the last 20 years telling us we're all going to, British children aren't going to see snow after 2008 and all these things that have turned out to be completely wrong. But more importantly, it's the technocrats who cried wolf. And so they just doubled down on the fear, and now we're all going to die in 9 years or whatever it is, right? What Charles calls for is a revolution of love. So instead of like submitting to globalist plans of having corporations own rivers for their own good out of fear, it's like, well, actually, I quite like trees. I quite like dolphins and oceans that you can swim in, and just I quite like non-human beings, and to operate from that place, it fundamentally changes. I would argue that's a more animist place. It's just generally a more mystic place, but that's what happens when you get in and understand where those words came from, I think.
Yeah, that's beautiful because that's the initial impulse of the child. When you tell a child, hey, this species is endangered, and they say, oh, what does that mean? It's like, oh, well, we're losing this. There's no more of this animal, or there might not be any more of this animal soon. Immediately, the reaction is going to be like, but that's really sad. They're really beautiful things. I love them. Even if they've never met them, there's this initial impulse like, but love, and that's brilliant because if we, right now the impulse, the push is the fear, which is not just in climate, it's in all kinds of things.
And surrender, like Zoomers have given up, right? They're basically just assuming the worst case scenario is going to happen in their early adult, they're early adults now, but like in their mid 30s, I guess, if we just wind it forward 9 years, so even if things are even if all of these catastrophic predictions that have been wrong every single time since the late 70s by miles, like Lower Manhattan isn't underwater and all the rest of it, this should be good news. This should be good news that the worst case scenarios are wrong, right? But they've just kind of given it up. And the trouble with that is that, and we're seeing it, that makes them very amenable to the technocratic grab, the technocratic centralizing power grab, because they're basically, well, it's all going to be fucked anyway. We should, and it's a challenge. So we're in this weird situation where the greatest risk of climate change is climate alarmism, right? So it's actually not the warming impact, and it's not that isn't happening. It's that this stuff is going to really mess us up first, right? This thinking, because we're going to turn around and all of a sudden it's going to be Nestle presents the Amazon.
I laugh, but that's actually quite reasonable, or not reasonable, but likely. when you speak of that alarmism, and specifically I guess what we're looking at is we look at nature and environment as something out there that we cannot, or if we experience it as something that's around, outside, something we're not connected to, something that has obligations in the way that visiting the grandmother that you don't really like has obligations. I should do something for this because, well, it's dying. She's dying, so I should go visit her, but I don't really want to. And there's all kinds of things that come with that: the panic, the shouting, the fear, the desire for control. You want someone to take over. You want someone to fix this because what is presented as possible, as far as fixing, and fixing isn't even the right word again. Again, we have problems with language, but the change in relationship that is required is not something that is presented in the list of potential fixes.
No, it's
So
making
that
it's taking the separation to its ultimate blow off top conclusion, right? Because we were sharing before we recorded this, depending on when it comes out, Paul's Kingsnorth Substack, and he was just this perfect paragraph referring to George Monbiot as a urban vegan intellectual who in his latest book basically wants humans to be living on genetically modified slime grown in vats, so that the so-called countryside can be so-called rewilded, so that he can go on little jaunts from London and look at wolves, right? That is the stupidest science fiction like nonsense. I mean, he's actually insane, so that's like that's a bad example. But even if you don't realize that the story is being framed in this kind of technocratic materialist naturalist way, then the only solutions that present are ones that actually fulfill and further embed that technocratic framework. Right now, what I've like as a permaculturalist and just in general been interested in is, and I put a lot of this in the book, but there's a couple of some of the research around so-called invasive species really appeals to me as like a chaos magician, post-anarchist, whatever, because it's a fucking hot mess, a glorious hot mess of nature. We seem to think that nature is like a Victorian zoo, right? Like, so what nature is what it looked like in 1850 when Dutchmen and Englishmen went to South America with their little books. That's why materialist naturalism, and like drew pictures of frogs and flowers and everything. Where we found it in 1850 is plainly where it belongs, and it can't go anywhere else. And that's it.
And
right?
each
nature.
time that we found it, it was the first.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Now, if we look at the impact of the increased carbon dioxide in the environment over the last 40 years, as NASA said, we've actually grown 2 entire Indias of green mass, like of actual, and woodland, right? So it's plant food. That should be celebrated, right? And people are like, oh, but it's like, then they'll say, but it's the wrong kind of trees, it's in the wrong place. I have never met a wrong tree. I really haven't. I've never met a wrong tree. That's not how it works, right? Now, would it be better if we still had more of the kind of like, ancient forest? Yeah, totally, right? But I'll take this as well. And there's this kind of gloriousness of as humans continue to live out of relation in a very destructive and damaging way, when you realize that the more than human world has its own agency and it responds and even sometimes uses it, like there are beings that are thriving because of our destruction, right? Like, and that's part of understanding the good that's happening. That's part of understanding that biodiversity can include things that we would consider weeds, right? Like from a permaculture perspective, there's no such thing as a weed. We call them recovery species. Certain things will grow and disturb soil until the soil is less disturbed, and then another species kind of a series of species succession happens up until kind of like wherever you are, if you're in a temperate area, a forest, right? But just in general, these beings are on their own shit just as we are. And that's good. That's actually really, really good. And in fact, many of the, not all of, but like many of the alarmist stories about so-called invasive species come from the same eugenic World Wildlife Fund that was founded by eugenicists. And it's the same idea of purity, right? Like these certain people belong here, these people belong here, and we need to be managing who and what grows. It's literally the same ideology, right?
I do feel like there's not much of a difference at all between this blackberry is not where it's supposed to be and this black person is not where they're supposed to be.
That's
It's
exactly
the
it.
same.
That's
Yeah.
we have a discipline called invasion biology, right? That is some ethno-state stuff, right? That's just that's a fucking mess, and you don't find that in indigenous cultures, right? So I think I used Wolf Dieter Stoll's story when he was learning from a Lakota medicine man in the 70s, and he pointed at a so-called invasive species and said that shouldn't be here, and the Lakota, I think it was Lakota medicine man said, just this is a new arrival. Let's see what they want. Let's see what they do. Let's see what we can do together. And it was this idea that this plant, because he's a medicine man, he's like, and his job is, plants. Here's a new plant. The right attitude is like, let's see what's going on here. Like it might be the case that it needs to be removed because of whatever, but he's like, no, let's see what this one's doing. And it's just kind of crediting that we're not the only game in town, so to speak, right? And when you operate there, there's actually a lot more cause for optimism, and there are way more allies when it comes to this urgent journey of coming back into relation, however you understand it, instead of the kind of eating out of vats of slime, technocratic guardian future, right?
Yeah. Well, when I read things like that, when I read or hear those ideas, though, to be fair, in person, I rarely hear those. It's more the people on the platforms, the Guardian, the other large newspaper columnists who will tell you this is what we need to do. I have a plan.
Yes.
The question is always, but when's the last time you've actually been in those places? And what exactly is your relationship to the place where you are right now? The point that Kingsnorth makes on Monbiot being an urban vegan is really important.
Urban vegan intellectual. It was even bitchier. I loved it.
I do like Kingsnorth's bitchiness. It's always really cute. But that there's a distance implied within the urban, which is not to say that the urban requires a distance, but it's kind of, and it's weird to say this because the urban, of course, is where you're all close together, and yet that closeness together enforces or creates a distance from the actual place you are in, to the point where, streets are things you walk through to get to another street. Places are things you have to get past in order to go to where you're really going, even if that place is exactly where you start from. And the matter of place and space, I think, is incredibly important because we think of place and placeness. And I'm going to go back for a second because with the question of nature, the way that I tried to get around it get around those problems was to go back to its verb, which was a more original sense, the nature ring, as opposed to nature as a solid, dead noun. And I think with place, we can do the same thing. Place is placing. That when you are within a place, you are placed there. There is other things are part of this place. It's an active process. It's not a dead artifact. It's not a museum piece, or you cannot put it in one of those botanicals. It's where you are and where you start from, and where everything else interacts with you, and you interact with them. It has this living, almost intense and terrifying, I think, initially, sense of relationships and obligations where you realize, wow, I'm here, this is the place I'm in, and this is really uncomfortable because there's lots of other things here, and I don't even acknowledge them most of the time, and I don't acknowledge my existence here. Instead, I'm always trying to be somewhere else, or trying to go somewhere else, or living in that intellectual urban mindset of looking at the world distantly, looking at place as space, the idea of the map.
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about that, which is why I was bringing that up. The point you make, I think, that is the most profound. And to be clear to everybody listening or watching it, there are a lot of very profound points in Ani.Mystic. It's a really good book. So good that it cannot easily be reviewed. But that's what this discussion is for. And that's not just me being lazy. I honestly did try. I have several drafts of my attempts of reviewing this book months ago.
A few have tried. I've had messages from people, so that's good.
Yeah, and just so you know, so you don't. I'm sure you probably don't have a self-esteem issue with this, but just so you don't get a self-esteem issue with this, like it's too complex for a review. And that's brilliant because it's the beginning of a conversation that I think. That I'm trying to have here, or we're trying to have here, but I think is something that is extremely relevant for anybody who's trying to get out of this sense of urgency, of panicked alarm, and to understand, okay, so, where do I start from? It's like, well, you start from here. You start from the place you are, and you can look around you. Which the profound point that you make is the one on custodianship. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk on that first, and then I'll ask you some questions.
In what sense? Just to describe what it is, or?
So, to describe what it is, and particularly, you borrow a couple of other ideas as well, or not even borrow, you inhabit a few ideas, or you give those place as well, and play with them. The idea of sanctuary, the idea of custodianship, the idea of this creative or co-creative relationship.
Yeah, so this, in particular, I use custodianship, as I understand it, in an Aboriginal context of being traditional custodians of the land, as the ongoing decolonial, post-colonial legal process of treaties and land return and all the rest of it continues. One of the things that comes up is like, well, are you the traditional owners? And like, we don't own, and so custodianship and traditional custodians is the word that's used most common. And it's perfect. It's perfect because that is the natural function of any human. This comes back to what I was saying, that Sutahulmaya believed that if we're not actually feeding the gods, and in fact being beautiful, the gods are fed by beauty. And so we are supposed to live beautifully. And it's why the women have little bells on their incredible dresses when they're just like going to get water from the lake and what have you. They're just being beautiful. And that is feeding the gods, right? So that's that way of being in the world that acknowledges the rest of the world, that there are other beings around, right? So custodianship is humans have certain capacities as everyone else does, right? And it's a fundamental change in understanding what your role is in, again, we're going to use community, but like in a local place sense, coming along with that, not just the more than human beings and the human beings, the historical context, the spirits of the dead, the place where you are. This stuff is all, you are the custodian of it. And we use we use it in a janitorial sense. And at the moment, that's not wrong, right? Like custodianship at the moment actually does imply cleanup. In our context, it sort of does. But it's this, when you go to think about, we have about 4 or 5 different unsatisfactory words underneath it that custodianship can kind of replace, that you can inhabit instead, right? Owner is one of them. And not, I don't just mean, this isn't necessarily just a real estate conversation, because again, custodianship as a notion emerges from frameworks that don't have ownership like that, right? So custodianship is stepping into the relational obligations and responsibilities of place and time and the rest of it. And that's initially backwards looking, but it's forward looking in what it does, right? It's looking with truth and integrity at what is around you and what has happened and what is continuing to happen, and working out, and this is really high philosophical stuff, like where one can intervene or what one can do. Because actually, in many respects, the origins of, I guess, not that the book has politics, but the politics of the book would be very much Bayo Akomalafe's idea of post-activism. And I've been saying for about a decade, what do we do when doing is fraught? And custodianship is one of those answers. Instead of like, we got in this mess by lots of doing and lots of like, action and having a plan and going and doing a thing. This is the thinking that gets us into this world in the first place, right? So that thinking's not going to get us out, right? And post-activism and his kind of like whole oeuvre around that, including making sanctuary, which I'll get to, is really powerful. And it's the sanctuary stuff and post-activism is very inspired by his sort of West African philosophical roots. Some of the later things to do with cracks and the rest of it is more overeducated $5 word lefty stuff that doesn't fit quite as well. Not that I don't love him, but that's some of the words are overemphasis on body and cracks and so on in a way that's just like word bingo. But these two core ideas, I think, make up for a lot. And one of them is post-activism. It's like, what do we do when like doing is part of the problem? And essentially one of the things he settled on is this idea of making sanctuary. And I love this, right? I love it because it contains the monstrous and it is open to all. So he takes it from that medieval idea of you can seek sanctuary in a church. And it's essentially a no questions asked space for the broken and the fearful and the damaged and those on the run. And I like it because the implication is you're on the run from the state, although there is a Holy Roman Empire, so you have run into another one at that point. But hey, cross that bridge when you come to it. But he's very fascinated by the gargoyles on medieval churches, right? So the idea of malformed body, well, not even malformed, differently formed bodies and bodies that have been shaped by what they've been through. And are not turned away, and are in fact markers of sanctuary. So this idea of you will know sanctuary by places where the bodies have been differently formed. And in a sense, when I say differently formed, I mean monstrous. You will, but gloriously. You will know this place by its monstrous bodies. And that's where you can start to look for and find sanctuary. And that's a perfect entry into what we can do. And this is what I mean by it's not a real estate conversation, because making sanctuary in my case at the moment has been making sure there's, quote unquote native habitat for certain birds and things along my river and doing, and improving the soil and all the rest of it, right? So there are things that I can do in this context that I couldn't have done renting in a West London share house. But I could still be making sanctuary in a West London share house, right? Because it's this idea of a place of monstrous bodies and a place of visibility for context and a place of awareness from all of this shit and all of this this doing and relentlessness. And there's something about it. For about 15 years now, I've been calling this. I have this idea that like we're in a Rivendell project because I'm a gross Tolkien nerd and unapologetically so. And it was the last lovely house west of the sea. And so things aren't going great and things are going to get worse. And they're going to get a lot worse before they get better. And so what I've been calling the Rivendell project is like, how do you inhabit a Rivendell? What is that for you? And again, it's not land. It's what are the things that you can keep in a Rivendell context going when everything else is turning to shit, right? And that there's something to that in sanctuary when it's like this. There is a place of making unruly and novel connections, and out of that something that doesn't fit in a plan, doesn't fit expectation, will happen. and it's animist in the sense that it's collaborative. It is what all you do is show up and relate. All you do is show up and relate, and what comes of that will be next. And it is the opposite of like, no, we need a 5-year plan, and we need to put these trees up this hill here and plant them, and all the rest of it. We need to. The human must be the only thing in control. The human is the one thing that has agency. And Sanctuary is like, actually, we don't. And every time we think we do, we keep messing it up. So Sanctuary is placemaking for unruly connections between monstrous bodies, human and non-human. And I just love it. I think it's just genius.
That's adorable. That's beautiful. I think immediately I'm in my head with all of the having read Lord of the Rings multiple times as a child, with this sense of this part that is existing as everything is falling apart, and having been cultivated, but cultivated not in a as a, hey, let's grow what's here, let's grow from what's here.
And something not Gandalf, something Galadriel said, which has haunted me in my most recent rereading, which was in July in New Zealand. She's talking about the elves that stay behind to fight the long defeat. And I love that. So that's what Rivendell is, and that's what Lorien is. They're there fighting the long defeat. And obviously it's several thousand years because they're elves and so on. But are you okay fighting the long defeat? And I am, right? What else is there to do? And part of that is making Sanctuary.
And I think too that I think is extremely hopeful, or it should give anybody hope. That more than half the world right now lives in cities. I think most people, when they think of, okay, I want to do this, they think, okay, so I have to save up money to get some land outside of the city so I can start doing this, and okay, I need to find this place now, and okay, so I have to work really hard, and of course that's gonna cause me to contribute more to the system, and by the time I get to this promised land, this idea that's outside of everything where I can finally start this project, you will have changed yourself to a point where you will no longer want to do that, and instead the idea of starting exactly where you are, of being a custodian of the place of which you are a part, not the place you are, but a place of which you are part. You start there. Like that's one of the things I tell people when they ask about how to do this. Like, okay, so walk through your street, just right outside of your house, and look for places where the tree roots are pushing up the concrete. Look for places where things are cracking open, and try to understand that, or try to see that as what it is that you're trying to do as well. Instead of trying to exit everything and wait until you get to that exit, no, you start now, and then you learn, one, how hard it is, but also how little you know, and how exciting it is to start learning that, and to start asking the questions of the place around you, because every place is going to have different beings that are going to give you different answers, and you have to learn how to ask those questions in the first place, and then how to learn to hear for them. Now, I wanted to end with something you wrote really recently. It was an essay that I thought was quite profound, because it ties back into this idea of custodianship. Of course, with the monotheist Abrahamic creation story and the fall from the Garden of Eden, and there's this idea of the dominion over the plants and animals, the beasts of the air and the sea, or whatever. That humans are responsible for those things, and therefore they can make the decisions as if they are kings. But that idea of kingship is much more like, a CEO than it is of any of the older ideas of royalty. And you mentioned in an essay, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the title, but you were talking about the death of the Queen, and
Yeah.
also about the idea of symbolic order. That there are multiple orders, the political order, etc. But there is an importance in someone holding the symbolic order, or someone's. And that's a sense that we've completely lost. We think of symbolic as something that is completely imaginary and so therefore does not exist, even though the word imaginary originally didn't even mean something that does not exist.
No, exactly.
But, so
I
you
don't know
say
how people,
symbolic,
like, I
rigid.
get, yeah. I'm an animist who holidays in Gnosticism because I can't explain how precise and perfect the attacks on the imaginal or the spirit world have been without using a metaphor which may be true of an entity doing its damnedest to destroy and attack it, right? So
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
yeah. The idea that we can trap the spirit world in a monkey's head and call it fake, that's quite a trick. That's well done, right?
It really is.
Hats off. It leaves me speechless. And so it always just interests me. I mean, she's dead now, but this happens with anywhere that still has monarchies, where they're referred to as largely ceremonial, as if that means innocuous. Whereas, as I just said, ceremony is the most important thing that humans do for half the world. And we say it as like largely ceremonial means like it doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, it's the opposite. It's how meaning is made, right? And so symbolic order, I think, is really important. And I've sat with this for a while. Like David Graeber kind of wrote about it in On Kings. I mean, he did. I don't think he got not insufficiently magical, right? So it's always been my contention that the reason anarchism, but like generally speaking, left stuff, but mostly anarchism never really got currency out is because it's essentially a critique or a preferred way of organizing human relations inside European factories. And it requires getting rid of kings, which hold universes together in New Guinea or Brazil or somewhere, right? So you like, oh, no gods, no masters, no kings, get rid of him. It's like, well, then the world will end. What's wrong with you, right? And it's that inability to operate in the spirit world, because all of those kind of critiques on how we organize industrial labor in 19th century Europe are downstream from thinking that the spirit world is in a monkey head, right? Like it's all thoroughly unhaunted. So it's very interesting when you get a moment which none of us have experienced in our lifetimes, like when the Queen dies, because the symbolic, whatever you want to call it, was felt everywhere. Like I was on a boat for the wedding in between the mainland of Australia coming back to Tasmania, and you could feel it there. You could feel this was during the funeral. There hasn't been a ceremony like that like ever on the planet, which interests me, but it is a kind of ceremony that's happened for 100,000, 200,000 years on this planet, and we're just so unfamiliar with it but it has a reality because there it is showing up, and that sitting with like kingship as a word for humans being in a kind of right relation, and having fulfilled their obligations and having them back. It reminded me of my shaman in Peru, because when he walks through his land, like the dietas we go to are on his land. It's a private thing rather than a retreat or whatever, right? And I swear to God, the trees bow to him like he's Celeborn as he goes by. There's like a kingship, and he's been doing this for decades. He was Terence McKenna shaman, right? Like, that's a king. That's a king. I've met Harry and, been in the room with a number of the main ones, right? They do have an energy to them for sure. I don't know how much of that is like projected from humans, but my shaman doesn't have any of that, and he has kingship. He has that kind of power. So I like. It was a dare I say a teachable moment, the passing of the Queen, to kind of realize, this isn't just stuff that, dare I say, I think about or we think about. This is in the human kind of like collective psyche in some way, and that has implications. It's like, well, what do we do with that? What do we do with that on a group basis, which we can only speculate upon, and how do we incorporate that kind of understanding into our lives? It doesn't mean we should all be kings, but it's like, well, what is your king? Like how does that work? What kingdoms do you fall under? And that's been there in European magic, and it's worth pondering.
There was a point in so my friend Judith O'Grady, she had written a book, a very tiny book, but she sent it to me, and I read it, and it was completely life changing for me. She brought up the point within the book that, you know, before the idea was these gods, these spirits, whatever, were interacting with kings, and now because we don't do kings, everybody's a king. But no one's interacting with these spirits. And I don't mean no one, but the idea is, okay, so we got rid of this class or this function, but we also, you know, the relationships required or the relationships involved in that function are not being fulfilled. We didn't come up with a better plan. We just beheaded it and are wondering why, you know, no one's in charge. Yeah,
I think about it a lot.
It's not that no one's in charge of humans, but like no one, you know, there's no center here. But of course, before there were millions of centers, and we're all supposed to be a center now, but we don't, you know, we don't even think about that. It's
no,
like, okay, now
everyone's
we
a
can do whatever
king who's shirking the obligations. It's a good observation, right? Because and this is silly historical stuff, but the it's not evident from the archaeological record if kingship emerged from shamanism, like shaman in speech marks as a category rather than, you know, Siberia, or vice versa, or co-evolved because of the overlap in function, right? Like, so a pharaoh is a shaman in chief, and no one's doing that role anymore. And that role was to get up and be the human participation of the sunrise every morning. That's not praying to the sun. That's being the human side of this event that happens, which is the sunrise. Like that's what Dr. Nadler calls man's share of these events. That's what ceremony is. It's not, and we miss that in a dualist sense. It's like, oh, he's up to worship the sun. And that's that 19th century English claptrap. It is to be the human participation in the sunrise. And we don't, like the royal way, like some of us do, but there is no one, there is no pharaoh doing that. And that is an obligation. That like, so the human share of the sunrise is not happening, or the human share of whatever it happens to be. That's powerful. That gets us back to the Kogi and what they said about, you know, the objects in European museums. Like where if we don't do ceremony, everything breaks, and we stop doing ceremony and everything broke.
How do you think people, especially those completely kind of new to this way of thinking, could start to move into that custodianship?
Read the book, obviously, but assuming they have or haven't, operationally, you will need to know the context of where you are. And it doesn't mean I'm going to spend 3 months in the local library. You will probably spend a bit of time in the local library. But it's kind of like a gathering up of resources to know what you can know about your land, right? Like I live in La Torita, Tasmania, which is where the worst genocide, I know you want to end on a positive note, the worst genocide of the British Empire ever happened was here. And so there's place name, we don't know place names around here or anything, because the Imperial project was too effective. And in fact, not that far from here, maybe about 40 minutes on the coast, it was essentially the last native Tasmanian, let's say, concentration camp on the beach there, on the mainland. So there's some really dark stuff that happened here. I hope if you're in Tasmania and watching this, you know what I'm talking about. Hopefully everyone else is a few rungs up from that, because it's pretty bad here in that case. But I would start with the trouble of the place and that kind of Donna Haraway idea of staying with the trouble, because a gathering up of like, well, what am I making sanctuary from is a really good start to that process. It's like, well, and it's a resource play, and it's intuitive, because you're going to have to do two things. You're going to have to know something about the context of where you are, and then you're going to have to feel where you think your role in what happens now or next is. And again, people are like, oh, cool, well then I'll join some kind of I'll donate $10,000 to a local Aboriginal group and I'll join some kind of activist thing. And you've gone back on that solutionist path when you do that. That might be your route, but the key is to inhabit a way of being that doesn't sort of future project like that, but allows other agencies to come through. Like, well, what does place want from you? What do place spirits? What does the historical context want from you? So it's necessarily going to be very, very different. But the key thing, just to turn it back, I guess, to the positive or uplifting component to it, is you only do this for a little while before you kind of like never get lonely again. That's something I learned at the very beginning of my shamanic training with Alberto Villoldo, where he's putting spirits of the lineage into your different body parts. And he's like, put them in as a seed to grow. But like he says, you'll never be alone again now. You have these with you. And you can do it that way. That's one way of doing it. But actually just being in relation to place and context and those spirits. Once you actually kind of feel rather than know that the universe is composed of a community, only some of whom are human, it's very difficult to get lonely. You can get sad, but it's very difficult to get lonely. And so that's kind of like one of the early rewards, I think. But that's how I would begin.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this discussion. Thanks for listening to The Realign. Gordon White's work can be found at runesoup.com, and his book, Ani.Mystic, Encounters with the Living Cosmos, can be ordered from its publisher at scarletimprint.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it. Paid subscribers of From the Forest of Arduino can view or listen to episodes immediately as they are released. Most episodes can be viewed or listened to several weeks after release on YouTube, Spotify, and all other major podcast distributors. Find out more at readwildermuth.com or read.substack.com.